I'm now handing over the next sessions to the beautiful MC.
Our speakers in this session today is Associate Professor Dr. Tesha Sengupta-Irving, Associate Professor from Learning Science and STEM Education, and Affiliate Associate Professor, UCB Center for Race and Genders from University of California, Berkeley, United States of America. Dr. Tesha completed a PhD in Mathematics Curriculum and Teacher Education at Stanford University, where she was awarded the Stanford Graduate Fellowship, a Spencer Research Training Grant, and a Spencer Dissertation Fellowship. She completed her postdoctoral studies at the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Science, where she also served as Assistant Director of Research for the UCLA Lab School. Prior to joining the UC Berkeley faculty, Dr. Tesha held academic position at UC Irvine School of Education and Vanderbilt University Peabody College of Education. Ladies and gentlemen, before the presentation begin, let me inform how the presentation will be going on. First is the presentation of the material from Dr. Tesha. The second is Q&A session. At last is a conclusion from moderators. Now, allow me to welcome the speakers. Dr. Tesha Sengupta-Irving to deliver her presentation. Dr. Tesha, yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and try to share screen here and see if I can do that successfully. Can everybody see this okay? This looks okay?
Okay.
Okay, great. Good day. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I greatly appreciate it. My name is Tesha Sengupta-Irving, and I am an Associate Professor of the Learning Sciences at STEM at the UC Berkeley School of Education. I would really like to thank the organizers of Third Access and the Faculty of Teacher Training and Education at University Mataram for this humbling invitation to speak with you today, and a special appreciation to Rati Apsari for making it possible. I come to this work in STEM education as an Indian immigrant and now a naturalized US citizen. I was previously an electrical engineer and a mathematics teacher in a low-performing, low-income high school in California. I myself was raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is a multicultural place with multiple ethnicities, languages, and histories, which very much informs what I see as important in the education of young people in schools. A very popular and rather brilliant African-American educator in the US named Bettina Love wrote a column recently titled, "Teachers, we cannot go back to the way things were." In it, she argued, as we all stand in the midst of a world crisis, those of us who can dream must dream. And after we dream, we must demand and act. We must radically dream because before COVID-19 closed our schools and dismantled our way of life, schools were failing not only children of color, but all children. We cannot go back. We now have the opportunity to not just reimagine schooling or try to reform injustice, but to start over. Starting over is hard, but not impossible. We now have a skeleton of a playbook. It starts with creativity, teacher-student relationships, and teacher autonomy. In my address today, I'm going to suggest something radically different for US STEM and education. In a moment, I will show you how little movement the US has made for minority children in our country, and therefore why it is important to dream and do differently in the devastating wake of the COVID-19 global pandemic. Over a 15-year period, here depicted as 2003 to 2008, the US has made almost no gains in student math outcomes. This is the orange mark just below here. If the pandemic doesn't show us, then certainly these statistics before the pandemic should. It is time for a radically new dream for our students. As important, this dream should serve minority children. This graph, for example, illustrates the enduring race and class stratification of math outcomes among youth in the US. The left column are students who are of low socioeconomic background, all who have lower scores than their wealthier counterparts on the right-hand side. And in both columns, we see how Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic youth are among the lowest performing overall. I reject the idea that these children or their families are somehow inherently deficient. I reject the idea that these children and their families are somehow less capable. I reject the idea that these children and their families are not motivated to do well in school. Instead, as a critical social scientist in education, I have to look to the legacy and history of US public schools to contextualize these outcomes. In the US, the education of minority children has a long history of being cast as a project of human capital. The legacy of white supremacy, of settler colonialism and neoliberalism demand that children be assimilated into the dominant or racially white ways of knowing and being in this country. In STEM, this comes in a simple national slogan like math for all or algebra for all and science for all. But for the last 40 years since these slogans began, there has been almost no equality of opportunity for all. In fact, prior research shows us that these minority youth describe their classrooms as alienating. They describe math learning as decontextualized. These students are more likely to be taught in traditional rote and remedial ways without projects or inquiry to try. These students show least progress and interest in mathematics. And even when we look at the highest achieving children in the US, they have below average interest in pursuing mathematics. So as a math teacher and a former engineer and now a teacher educator and social scientist, I am left asking, what is the value of high STEM achievement if children find little interest in pursuing it? Is it enough to ask children to endure mathematics in school, or dare we to dream that they enjoy mathematics in school? In my own work, I take the race and class stratification of society and school as a starting point from which to think about the education of racially minoritized youth. I then think about how these children come to our schools every day, armed with all that they have learned in their own families. And it makes me think about how teachers must have the capacity to learn about the other social worlds, like family and community, in which children learn mathematical and scientific practices, and that teachers must have the capacity to translate these into the different kinds of curricula that children experience in our schools. Here's a very quick and basic example of what I mean by children reasoning in social worlds beyond school. A very typical school math problem would ask a child, there are 26 kids at the beach. Then 37 more kids come. How many kids are at the beach now? Let me give you 5 seconds to figure out the answer to that. Assuming we all did our summations or arithmetic correctly, you should have yielded 63 people at the beach. You can applaud yourself for that if that's what you got as an answer. But what's interesting is the child writes this. Too many for COVID-19. So one could laugh and say that the child doesn't know how to add, or one could say that the child is in fact thinking about learning in relation to the social world of today. But it's not only that children learn to reason mathematically and scientifically in other places than school, but that often what they learn in their families are richer, deeper, and more authentic than what we teach them in school. Consider, for example, when I tried to tell my own primary school teacher how my immigrant Indian family counts. I showed her 1, 2 below the knuckle, 3 above the knuckle, 4, 5. Then the next finger, 6, 7 below the knuckle, 8 above the knuckle, 9, 10. And in this way, in my family, on one hand, we can count to 20, where each finger represents 5. The teacher listened to what I had to say and then said, no. You should count like an American. 1, 2, 3. And I distinctly remember thinking, what a silly old woman. She'll be reaching for her toes at 11 when I am only on my 3rd finger. The point of my example is simple. School math is less elegant and less efficient than what I was learning at home, but this teacher could not recognize anything of value in what I was learning from my immigrant parents about mathematics. This brings me to the demographics of US teachers and school-age children. On the left, you can see that in nearly 2 decades, the teaching workforce in the United States remains predominantly white, down slightly from 84 to 79%. And at the same time, the population of school-age children is split between white and non-white at the national level. But in California, where I live and teach, students are overwhelmingly not white, 78%. Why does this matter? Because in every nation, we see that this mismatch is causing misunderstanding between what children can do and what teachers want them to do. The dream I am putting forth would require that teachers have cultural competence, a competence that is typically not found in non-dominant or white teachers, but is not found in white or dominant teachers, but is often found in non-dominant teachers. So this mismatch between the histories of the teachers and the histories of the children is meaningful to the learning. In the tradition of critical social science research and cultural competence, I am talking about a curriculum in STEM in schools that is both window and mirror. By window, I mean that when we look at the mathematics or science curriculum we are teaching children, we should ask ourselves, what disciplinary worldview or epistemology are young people going to see in this curriculum? What values, practices, and ways of being am I asking them to learn? That would be the window. In terms of the mirror, particularly for minority children, it means asking, what would it mean to design STEM education so that minority children see their experiences, their history, and their ways of knowing and being reflected back to them also? In this talk, I am arguing it is important to think about epistemic heterogeneity, meaning the diversity of ways in which children know and do math and science when we teach them in schools. Allow me to offer a concrete example of why it is important and signals something deeper, richer, and more authentic for children. Here is a rather typical science activity in a classroom, classifying objects as either living or non-living. You could do this activity with me. A raccoon, living. An iPad, not living. Children, living. A chair, not living. But what of a sun? What about the water? In a science classroom, the answer should be, it depends on your epistemic stance. Western normative epistemic definitions of living say that living things need food to grow. They move, they respire, they reproduce, they excrete, they respond. And since water, sun, moon, and stars do not do those things, they are not living. But to an indigenous child, the indigenous epistemologies of science would say, the sun gives us life and is life. Water gives us life and is life. So that if a child can navigate between dominant Western answers like it is non-living in Western epistemology, but also be able to say in an indigenous epistemology, it is living, we are creating a more diverse set of opportunities for learning in which children can see both windows and mirrors. For the indigenous child in this classroom, it is a mirror of how their parents would talk about the sun and the water. For non-indigenous children, it is a window into new ways of thinking scientifically. But this is not just true of K-12 classrooms. In fact, in the United States, the science communities themselves are now talking about what they should have learned from indigenous epistemologies of science. Western scientists, here as depicted in headlines from the Smithsonian Institute, are arguing themselves that perhaps the key to unlock the great global threat of climate change, of limited renewable energy, of animal or land devastation is actually in indigenous epistemologies of science that Westerners cannot answer. Thus, what I am arguing for children in schools is something that is already happening in scientific communities throughout the country and the globe. In the second part of the talk today, what I thought I would do is describe a very particular study, a case study in which I worked with a group of practicing STEM teachers to talk about this idea of cultural or epistemic heterogeneity in an article that was published in the Journal of Cognition and Instruction. The title of the paper was Stories of Garlic, Butter, and Ceviche, Racial Ideological Microcontestations, which basically refer to arguments about race, and microaggressions, which are acts of racism among secondary STEM professionals in a seminar that I designed. Allow me to provide some context first. This study talks to or draws upon three bodies of contemporary research in education, particularly in STEM. The first is research at the intersection of race or culture and teaching, which has largely focused on being colorblind and teachers wanting to ignore children's diversity as important to their teaching. The second is research at the intersection of race or culture, disciplinarity, meaning math or science, and teaching. The focus in this body of literature has been on helping teachers to figure out how they can leverage children's everyday practices at home or community into the formal mathematics classroom curriculum. How do we make a bridge between what they know and do elsewhere and what they do with us in schools? The challenge that this literature identifies for us is that teachers are generally unfamiliar with what minority children do at home. And they tend to devalue the families and the practices of what children do at home, much like the teacher who told me I was not counting correctly. Finally, this study speaks to research at the intersection of just race and teachers, which draws a distinction in the cultural competence and knowledge of racism between white and non-white teachers, as well as the kinds of racial conflicts that can emerge among them and the kinds of small or big acts of aggression that occur in our schools and in our professional development seminars, which, I will add, you will see in a few moments. The project was a case study of secondary STEM teachers, and I had chosen the release of the Next Generation Science Standards as an opportunity to bring them together. The Next Generation Science Standards are the US's national science standards that were released in 2013, and for the first time included 8 engineering practice standards for children to try in schools. As a former engineer, I was extremely excited about these standards because, as the standards argue, engineering is the solving of human problems. So to me, if we're going to teach engineering, it means the social world of the children has to enter the classroom so that they can talk about and solve problems in their real lives. Working in collaboration across the departments of education and engineering in a large public California university, I designed a 9-day professional development seminar and recruited 12 teachers from local schools who all worked with minority children and represented a range of STEM disciplines. Each day, the 12 teachers would start in the morning with a group of engineers doing a project similar to what engineers do in their labs. In some cases, they modeled heart disease. In other cases, they studied climate change. In some cases, they built a battery out of renewable energies. In this way, every project was meant to show the connection between social worlds and engineering and create an opportunity for teachers to do it with their own students. In the middle of the day, over lunch, the teachers would then talk about the research that I had presented to them, showing how different math and science teachers had been making bridges between children's home lives and school, children's home lives and school. And then finally, at the end of the day, the teachers would sit together and sketch out a possible lesson plan that would bring together the engineering project from the morning and what they had learned from the research study over lunch. The seminar itself centered cultural heterogeneity, and there were 3 principles. 1, I wanted the teachers to understand that cultural heterogeneity is foundational to any learning of math or science. Second, that heterogeneity can be meaningfully leveraged toward teaching in the classroom. And third, that when you engage cultural heterogeneity, you are also raising the authority, the epistemic authority of minority children and their families to be seen as scientific, as people who know science, even if it does not look like a normative scientist. The data we collected were video recordings of all of the conversations that the teachers had. There were 2 focus group interviews, but we split the teachers for a total of 4 videos. The written work from teachers included their daily reflections about what they were learning, the sketches of lessons that they worked on together, and any quick writes or notes that they had made during the day. We then asked the teachers to pick 2 lessons out of the whole seminar that they wanted to polish, finalize, and use with their own students. When I read through and analyzed those 24 lessons, I was looking for 2 things. Did the teachers engage with engineering as I had hoped? And did they try to integrate cultural knowledge or children's social worlds beyond school? In fact, when I analyzed the 24 lesson plans, what I found was that only 1 lesson plan tried to do both things. Only 1 lesson plan showed a teacher trying to do something that was not just based in school, but also included children's experiences outside of school. For many people, showing these results is an admission of my failure. I couldn't get the teachers to do what I wanted them to learn. But for me, I see this as an opportunity to learn again. What hadn't I anticipated? What can I learn from what the teachers are doing that would help me to do this again? To answer that question, I decided to focus on Rosa, the one teacher who wrote a lesson plan in which she combined the children building models of the heart and heart disease with field trips to a local hospital to speak with people on the subject of heart disease, doctors and patients, and to do research in their own families and neighborhoods about heart disease, which, she argued, is an extremely important topic for low-income and racial minorities families because of the high rates of heart disease in her own city. I analyzed all 6 hours of videos, lunchtime conversations with different teachers, and used 7 phases of video analysis. The full description of the analysis, the manifest content of what teachers said, and what I interpreted as the hidden meaning to what they were saying is available in the paper, and due to time, I won't discuss it here. But basically, we went through the transcripts of teacher talk and looked for the critical events in which we thought they were really trying to understand the value of cultural heterogeneity. The conversation I'm going to share with you today happened among 4 teachers. Rosa, of course. Rosa herself was Filipino-American, rather immigrant. She taught biology and chemistry for 14 years. She was in a group with Scott, a white male who'd been teaching science for 7 years, Brad, a white male who'd been teaching educational technology for 25 years, and Abraham, another Filipino teacher who'd been teaching mathematics for 9 years. The topic of conversation for the teachers was a study by Zoe and Bell with elementary school children. In the study, the researchers did 2 rounds of research with young people trying to describe health science practices, but they wanted to diversify what children knew are health science practices or to better understand the ones they do in their homes. The children themselves were mostly East and Southeast Asian. So, what happens in the actual paper that these teachers read is that first the teacher asks the children to go home and take pictures of health science. The children come back with very stereotypical mainstream pictures that you would find in any American science textbook, washing their hands or brushing their teeth. The teacher then tells them a story about how when she was young, her parents used to always give her chicken noodle soup to feel better. As soon as she did that, the children started telling new stories about health science. They described how their mothers make them drink Mangosteen every morning when they leave the house for good immunity and health, or how when they're sick, their parents do coining or dermabrasion in order to make them feel better. In this way, you see how it took 2 rounds for the teachers to actually get children to talk about non-dominant health science practices as legitimate topics in school. Well, the teachers had a great debate over this article. The debate unfolded under several exchanges. I'll share very briefly 4 of them here. There are 5 in the full paper. The first is the one I call a story of garlic. So Rosa immediately starts, and she starts with a story in which she talks about how in the Philippines, children will put garlic in their armpits to make their temperatures rise a little and get a fever so that they can skip school. Well, the 2 teachers that she's working with, Brad and Scott, are listening to her. Rosa then says, I came to give that idea as a lesson to my biology class. What is it in garlic that made the body temperature rise, she asks. Here we see that Rosa is positioning this as a cultural practice of children in the Philippines, garlic in the armpit. And for myself, growing up, my grandfather was an Ayurvedic doctor. I know that garlic is a heat generating food, so I understand what she's talking about. But what happens next is that Brad and Scott have no idea about garlic, heat, or science. And they say, that's funny. Did students think that was funny, that story? I've never heard of that, Brad says. Scott says, I've never heard of that. Brad says again, I've never heard that either. Oh yes, Rosa says, that is one of those that has been happening in the Philippines. Brad laughs and he looks at Scott. And you know, Rosa continues, the cultural processes are actually a good source of science fair projects, you know, science fair projects, yeah? Brad, to try some of them to see if it really works, you try putting garlic in the armpit to see if it really does make your temperature rise? Like you actually do that? Yeah, Rosa says, to find out. And it's going to have, you know, different ways you can see right here. And she gestures to the article. If you're using it and then you're going to make it into a science fair project using the science subject matter, yeah, it could be somewhat educational too. What you should notice is straightforward. Rosa is taking a cultural practice and suggesting that it has a scientific basis. Brad and Scott, using Western modern science as the norm and the right answer, say it is invalid, they have never heard of it, and in fact, laugh and mock Rosa for saying it could be a science fair project. In the second exchange, which happens immediately after, Brad tells a story about a boy in his neighborhood who's Hispanic or Latino, who falls down and gets a bump on his head. Brad and his wife run over to the child and put ice on the boy's bump. But then the parents come and they take the ice off and they put butter on the bump. And Brad finishes his story by saying, so, have you ever heard of that one? Well, Rosa says, you know, in my lesson, sometimes I think about the art of questioning, and we should, as science teachers, in order for students to really use science in their daily lives, we really have to point it out and ask, what makes it the butter to really let the bump rest right here? You know, some science, what's in it? Investigation. What I want to point out is that Rosa has not heard of butter on a bump before, much as the men earlier had never heard about garlic in an armpit. But different than them, Rosa is saying, maybe this is worth investigating. And that as science teachers, asking questions is more important than passing judgment. Brad, however, does not hear this and says instead, well, I didn't want to tell the kid his parents were stupid for putting butter on him, you know? I didn't want to necessarily go talk about it either, so I didn't mention it. In fact, butter on a bump has a very long tradition in Latino families as a way to lessen the bruise. Even in stories that you'll read of medics on the war field, they describe the use of butter on bumps to decrease bruising. Rosa then says, I'm learning though too, you know, their culture, meaning Mexican culture, is different. I remember another thing about this, what you call ceviche. Ceviche is a kind of food in Mexico. And then one of my students, she was the one who acted as a teacher to me because I didn't know, but she was the one who told me how to put on the tostada. So therefore, with the cultural insights from her, I began to learn. As an analyst, what is important about what Rosa is saying is that even though she's not talking about a scientific practice, she is suggesting that a Mexican cultural practice is something that teachers might want to learn from their students. She is suggesting that there is a reason to humble ourselves as teachers and ask, what can I learn from the cultural practices of students? Brad and Scott, however, remain unmoved. And the last 2 exchanges, and I'll go fairly quickly through these. The first is the story of Mangosteen. The teachers were confused about what is mangosteen. In fact, only Rosa knew what mangosteen was. In explaining why children might drink mangosteen every morning before they leave the house for good health, she explains, in the Philippines, they said it's good for maybe, I was rather thinking a scientifically based, it might be some kind of sour. So if it get vitamin C, that's why. Brad and Scott different than the first two exchanges, say something like this. Scott says, so it'd be like, Brad says, eating an orange? Scott says, yeah, you'd like drink some orange juice. For these two teachers, hearing the closeness between mangosteen and orange juice suddenly made something that could have been strange and weird or stupid cultural practice recognizable, legitimate, maybe even scientific. In that sense, this exchange was very different than the first two. The last one is about Vicks Vapor Rub, which honestly, I think all of us know. It comes from the article itself in which the children talked about how their parents put a green oil on them before they started coining. The teachers, other than Rosa, are wondering why you would need oil on your back. Rosa says, well, it's like Vicks Vapor Rub. You rub it here on your back, and then the menthol goes in and it opens up your lungs. Scott and Brad, however, much like the first two exchanges, say, I've never heard of that. I've never heard of that. And together they both say that if you read the directions on the bottle, it says Vicks Vapor Rub only goes on your chest and is smelled then through your nose. What is important here is the way in which they are relying on the legitimacy of the Western packaging to explain how it should be used, even as Rosa is saying to them, but this is the way my family does it. That illegitimacy of what they do not understand is part of the lack of cultural competence that either of them have in science. To summarize, here are the four exchanges. You'll notice that even when an exchange was unfamiliar, like butter on a bruise for Rosa, she still thought maybe there was something scientific about it. She stayed open to the possibility of cultural heterogeneity in science. For Brad and Scott, everything was unfamiliar to them, but the one place they were willing to concede maybe there is some worthwhile science is in the Mangosteen case, where they could make it closer to what they knew, like drinking orange juice. In terms of designing teacher learning, it's also important for me to look at the teacher dynamics in the far right corner. 3 of the 4 cases where the teacher is rather mean and harsh to one another, particularly against Rosa. But the one green one here, the drinking of mangosteen, was the one time in that hour-long conversation where the teachers actually seemed kind to one another. If I were to redesign this study, there are several things I would notice. One is that the colorblind research about children's race also refers to culture blind, a culture blindness about math and science where all you can see is Western whiteness. And I would discuss the epistemic authority about math and science more explicitly, helping teachers to let go of their deficit views of minority families and think about what is legitimately scientific in their homes. Third, I would think a lot about the kinds of racial arguments that teachers are having and the ways in which that can make racial minority teachers themselves vulnerable to white teachers in their groups. And last, it is essential to think about the storied knowledge of teachers. How often teachers will read research, but their own stories of practice seem more important to them to anything we put in front of them as far as research goes. In returning to the theme of this conference about the COVID-19 pandemic, I would say we are trying to radically redream what could be possible in our schools in STEM and not go backward. It is time to expand our reach to the diversity of epistemologies and ontologies that have long sustained human learning and that will require all of us as teachers and teacher educators to imagine cultural and epistemic diversity in math and science and learning in school learning. Moreover, that in the US, the racial hierarchies in STEM have to be disrupted, as do the ideologies of race and class that teachers hold about families or each other. If not, we will continue to erase, devalue, and dismiss as stupid what children learn in their families, when in fact, if we looked more closely, it is deeply mathematical and scientific. As both of these illustrations of cultural practices show, there's a great deal of proportional reasoning and geometry in both henna and hair braiding, which never in a US classroom gets described as deeply mathematical or scientific. But I dare to dream of a day when maybe it will. And with that, I say thank you to all of you for listening, and I am open to any questions or comments that you may have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tesha, for giving us such informative and interesting presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Now come to Q&A session. I'd like to have 3 questions from the participant. Please use the raise hand feature in Zoom, unmute your microphone, or the participant can ask through the chat room on Zoom. In chat room, there is Mr. Ahmad Sirul Haq. Mr. Ahmad Sirul Haq said, I think the ideological bias, homogeneity of perspective in education practice curriculum also occurs in many countries, including Indonesia. In your opinion, how do you make policymakers aware to avoid biased views against social phenomena in design educational curricula?
This is a wonderful question, Mr. Surulhaq. Thank you for the question. To be honest, I will sound a little pessimistic. I do not look to policymakers for radical change. They're too conservative. They have too many people that are pulling on them, and they have to answer to dominant people who have the money to back the educational policies and lobby for them. But if you think of teachers as policymakers, because whatever policy may be passed, it's the teacher who delivers it to the child. So if the teacher is the front lines of enacting a policy, then it is teachers who can diversify the ways that we teach math and science with children. And they can describe that and explain that as better math and better science. So slightly pessimistically, I'm going to say that I don't think policymakers, particularly I can speak to the US context, but I can also probably extrapolate to other countries. If there is inequality in a country, and that is in every country, it is the most powerful who make the policies. It is therefore unlikely that they will write a policy that destabilizes their power. I don't anticipate this happening in our textbooks, but I do think that teachers are making all kinds of decisions in classrooms that can benefit children.
Okay, thank you. Any question from the participant in this room? There one question from this session. In your video analysis, there are 7 passes. What the important for from the 7 passes for analyze your video analysis?
I'm sorry, what
you're collecting data from your research.
Yeah, what are the 7 phases? Did I hear the question correctly?
When you're collecting data, there's a step for analyzing the video analysis. There are 7 passes for analyze the video. The participant asks what the very important passes from the 7 passes that you use for video analysis.
Yeah, that's also a wonderful question. It's a methods question. I love methods questions. I think that there are at least 2 of the phases are the most important. So the first phase is just watching very carefully. And I like to do this with my team. So I have several students and they themselves are culturally very diverse. And at any time you can shout stop. So we play the video and then someone will say stop. I noticed something. And then they'll say something. This early attentive viewing, which is the first phase, attentive viewing, is very helpful because you start to see the large range of possibilities of what you might analyze within the video related to your research questions. After that, I turn it over to the students. We've had some conversation. They can see now what it is that we think is interesting and curious about the videos. And that second stage is writing the content logs. To me, that is a very boring stage. And I give that to my students because they tend to enjoy it, which is to write minute by minute, not exactly minute by minute, but chunk by chunk, what is happening on the screen. And then in the second column, what do they think it means? Why is it important? Their interpretive thinking comes in the second column. I don't typically do that phase. My students do that phase. But then we sit down and we read those logs together and we identify what Powell, Francisco, and Mayer, the people who invented the 7 phases, call critical events. moments where we really think big ideas are happening. And in fact, the 4 exchanges I gave you were the critical events that we saw in those 60 minutes. There were 5 total. I only presented 4 of them here, but those critical events become like windows into the argument or windows into answering the research question. So the most important phase is the first phase where you're very just generally curious. Second one I love is the critical events, because it really helps to say what you think matters most. And then of course, the third one, I'll add a third one, is constructing the storyline, which is putting all of those in a row together and then stepping back from the critical events and saying, what am I learning from this? What can other teacher educators learn from this? So for me, attentive viewing, critical events, and creating the storyline are the 3 most important phases of the 7 phases in video analysis. But I love video analysis. It's very fun to do with a group of people.
Okay, thank you. The last question from Dr. Sarman Alfarisi in chat room. Hi, Dr. Tesha. I have a question. If USA has universal values like American democracy, why do distinctive situations happen when you teach some children who come from a diverse race? Is it about difference in race only or because of another factors? Thank you.
I appreciate the question. I think that it's never just race. There are always other issues at play, particularly if children are coming from low-income families, so social class matters a lot. And also whether children are immigrants and are first-generation English speakers or not. All of those things matter a great deal in the US context. But let's take your example of American democracy. In fact, American democracy is not a universal value held by all. And I say that because, in fact, if you were to look right now in the US context, there are multiple threats to American democracy where those in power are trying to disenfranchise Black and Hispanic families from the vote. So they're redrawing various kinds of voting maps so that Black families, low-income families, immigrant families have a harder time voting. And if they do vote, that their vote doesn't count as much because of the way they have redistricted the map. This practice, what we call gerrymandering of the voting map, in fact means that sometimes, for example, wealthy white children will say, America is a democracy and everybody gets a fair chance. But a low-income immigrant or low-income Black child will say, America is not a democracy where everyone gets a chance. It's a rigged system. And if you're in the right place, at the right time, born to the right family, maybe your vote counts. But where I live, in a rural place where people are trying to steal the vote from us, it does not count. So in that way, even something like American democracy is a function of children's social locations on these unequal spectrum, like race or class or language or immigration histories. So I think it's a very provocative question. And I think there's very little in America that is uniform. When you look under the hood of the car, it is all a disarray. But on the hood of the car, it makes it look like we all think the same thing. But there's a great deal of dissent. It's, I guess, what makes for a good democracy is there's a great deal of disagreement and dissent within the country, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for other participants. In QA session, we have for 3 questions only. Thanks very much to the informative and interesting presentation, and thanks to all participants for very active participation. Dr. Tesha, proud to be your moderator today. Hopefully in time you can visit and vacation in Lombok Island. Warm greeting to one of our staff who is currently be your student in UCB, Ms. Rati.
Very much. She is a true pleasure. Thank you for letting us borrow her intelligence for a little while and learn from her. And Dr. Gurwan, I very much appreciate this opportunity. I do hope we meet in person someday soon. I would love that.
Okay, thank you. Finally, please give the applause for the speakers, Dr. Tesha, and for you all. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.